Okay, welcome to our panel on the social impacts of search. I'm Ramon Lobato. I'm an Associate Professor of Media and Communication here at RMIT, and it's a great pleasure to be chairing this panel. Okay, so to begin, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land, the Wurundjeri people, and to pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. So this panel is all about social impacts and contexts of search. In other words, what search means for our institutions, markets and societies. So this won't be a technical panel, although we will, get technical at certain points, but it's not going to be our primary focus. Instead, the aim is to think about how search technologies have both constructed and been constructed by people and the institutions we've created. So in the next hour, we're going to try and drill down into a bunch of questions like, how has search changed our relationship to knowledge? Who's in control of search technology and platforms? And what's the proper role of government in regulating search? So there's some pretty big questions. I'm not sure we'll kind of solve all of them, but we're going to have a go. And we're very lucky to have 4 incredible speakers here with very diverse and formidable expertise to help us navigate through some of these issues. So I'll introduce them one by one. So at the far end, Professor Kim Weatherall. Kim is Professor of Law at Sydney Law School, a Chief Investigator with the ADM+S Centre, and an internationally renowned expert in intellectual property law. Professor Alistair Moffat. Alistair is Professor of Computing and Information Systems at Melbourne University and a pioneer in information retrieval, and particularly in text and image compression. Louisa Bartolo. Louisa is a PhD candidate at QUT, just about to submit. Congratulations in advance. Louisa has a background in political science and policy. Louisa is a key member of ADM+S, whose work specialises in trust and safety in digital technology. And finally, Dan, Professor Dan Angus, Professor of Digital Communication at QUT, Director of the Digital Media Research Centre, and a Chief Investigator with ADM+S. So welcome everybody. Okay, so we have an hour and we're going to go back and forth with a bunch of questions ranging across the kind of social, industrial and regulatory aspects of search. So I wanted to start off. So we're so lucky to have Sue's incredible kind of history of search from the perspective of the people who were there developing it and innovating. I wanted to ask you, from your perspective and from your disciplinary expertise, so law, communication studies, computer science, digital communication, what would you add to that history? And for you, what are some kind of key turning points that you see in the history of search and that has shaped what search has become today? So Kim, perhaps we could start with you.
Sure. I'll offer the legal perspective as promised. Look, everything could have been different, legally speaking. Actually, Sue mentioned this at the, in passing. She said, at the very start of search, the IP position was unclear, and it really was. We could, under copyright law, we could have said, actually, you can't copy all this stuff and turn it into a big index and then use it for search. Which might have meant, I guess, that we might have continued to rely on things like titles and more metadata for search, which would have been a completely different experience. So the relationship with content providers could have been entirely different. We could have banned the copying, or, because copywriters always had the option of equitable remuneration and compulsory licenses, we could have made them pay, which would have had things entirely different again. So that's one interesting thing to think about. But, it wasn't a complete carte blanche on copyright. If you think about how the Google Book scenario played out, in the end, the copying of the books was found to be fair use, but the presentation of the context, only snippets allowed kind of perspective that we got from copyright law means that we actually get less context for search in that way. And so again, copyright law sort of shaping the way that search results get presented in that different context. There are other things we could have done differently from a legal perspective. We could have done responsibility entirely differently. You've no doubt heard, the big debate in the US over Section 230, this idea that the platforms are not actually liable for the content that they distribute, with some exceptions, notable exceptions. We could have imposed far greater liability on them, more like broadcasters, for example, which would have required vetting and again would have had an entirely different search experience potentially, and a different way of building that business. We could have done competition and antitrust differently and not allowed the bigger companies to take over multiple smaller companies. Maybe we would have had more diversity. And we could have done privacy differently. We could have had a different debate about the gathering of those behavioural logs. I mean, Sue has talked about how important that information about users has been, but that question of whose data is it that is being gathered when, you know, the search engine searches you or the platform searches you, is actually a debate we are having, continue to have, and also, I'll just say this, really need to have now, because, you know, as we talk about this idea of it moving into the physical world and, you know, being able to find the CVs of all the people in the room or their websites, you know, the privacy implications of that are striking, and I think something we should talk about. But I'll leave it there because I don't want to dominate.
Alistair.
So I should prefix anything that I say with a simple statement that I'm a bit of a fraud on this panel. It's the impact of search on society. I'm a computer scientist. We don't do society. We deal with possibilities and tweaks and looking at individual bits and saying I can use that bit better, and that's what I've spent best part of 40 years doing. And so, did we get it right? Well, we got it good, I think, is my answer to the question. I absolutely agree. I'm waiting for a lawsuit to emerge where generative AI gets sued for some statement and isn't able to hide behind, but we just presented that result from that webpage where the generative AI genuinely is attributed as the author of some malicious or inaccurate or misleading statement that results in you know, $1 billion loss to some company or something like that. So you know, from the uninformed side of the society, I'm waiting for that to happen and for attribution to come along and be made real. And there was a, you know, again, I'm getting my information from the newspaper. I receive the newspaper in hard copy every morning. A lawsuit or a law case in the States not that long ago where one of the lawyers used generative AI and it fabricated the precedents that were being cited, and the judge called it out, and that lawyer got censured, right? So there's a small example of what's going to go wrong. So I absolutely agree that attribution and responsibility and ownership has gone lacking, and it's been AWOL partly as a result of me and my kind doing what we know how to do and doing it better and doing it really well and getting it right, because we do kind of have the internals of search pretty much okay now. SIG-IR, we had a celebration yesterday for SIG-IR 1998, which we held in Melbourne 25 years ago. SIG-IRs of that generation had paper sessions called Efficiency 1, Efficiency 2, Efficiency 3. You go to SIG-IR now, there's no efficiency papers. Efficiency isn't on the table at SIG-IR anymore. It's more about the generative models and the human factors that go into it and so on. So you know, my part of it's done. I'm a fraud. I'm here to be good looking.
Thank you.
Yeah, so and I perhaps interpreted this question slightly differently, but one turning point in kind of thinking critically about this as academics was this very important paper in 2000 by Lucas Introna and Helen Nissenbaum, which was called Shaping the Web, Why the Politics of Search Engines Matter. And there they made this big argument, which continues to play out through all the research we continue doing today, which is that the way we order information is a profoundly political question. There are questions of power, monetary power, who gets to buy advertising that gives them a high ranking, etc. And there's just also questions of, do we want to leave these big questions to the market alone? And I think since then, the answer has been broadly yes, that's what we've done. Whether we wanted to do it or not, that's what's happened. But I would say that a potential turning point is coming now. We're seeing, for instance, I'm from Europe, and in the European Union, we're seeing new regulation around so-called very large online service search engine, sorry, which would include the likes of Google, of course, who will be subject to transparency requirements, and also supposedly will have to deal with so-called systemic risks, including things like risks to our democracy, concerns about misinformation and manipulation of the information environment. So I think we're in a very sort of interesting inflection point, also from a policy perspective, where we're starting to try to tackle some of these more political questions head on.
Thanks. So yeah, I guess me as the frustrated cultural studies academic in the body of a computer scientist, I would kind of take on this one and look at, in that 30 years, and Sue, it was an amazing, beautiful history that you presented. A question that I would have is, who were the people and how did power play a role in the development of those various search infrastructures? So if we look at the institutions, we look at the commercial organizations, the startups, the investment culture that surrounded the various kinds of investments, the kind of consolidation of power in the hands of a few throughout that 30-year history. The question then that is fairly obvious of the current moment is, are we about to see history repeat itself with regards to who has access to those various foundational technologies? How do we ensure in this moment that we allow more people in to be able to shape the eventual, the next 30 years of web search, of information access, of the creation of content, and what content is found and able to be discovered online? Because certainly I think we've had a chance in that, over that 30 years to reflect on that and reflect on how maybe we have got it a little bit wrong in terms of who we've given a seat at the table to, in terms of whose voices are amplified and whose voices are shut out from participating in those systems. So I think, yeah, there's a challenge for us in this present moment of reflecting deeply on that and thinking, right, we've got a great opportunity here with this new set of technologies to do it maybe a bit better, right? And to think, and I think institutions like ADM+S are a great start to this, because it starts to bring together the relevant expertise from all the different kinds of disciplines at least, but we also need to challenge ourselves to go further in terms of, it's not just academics, obviously, it's all corners of our society that we need to listen to. And like Sue's reflection on the, thinking about the users, right? Thinking about who is we. When we talk about the we in this technology or the groups that we're designing for, let's think really carefully about who are those groups and who are going to be using these and who are going to be impacted. So not just who is using this, but who is, I guess, impacted through the use of these technologies as well, even if they're not directly using them themselves.
And so do you have some particular examples in mind of where search could be performing better in that respect? More accessible, more diverse, more inclusive?
Yeah, it's interesting. I'll draw on some of the results from our Australian search experience. So in ADM+S, in the first few years, we've run an experiment where we had 1,000 plus Australians download a search plugin that Abdul Obeid, who's up the back there, developed, and Axel Bruns, who's also here, helped kind of initiate this project in its first days. What it did was searched a number of set terms on their machines. So it was a daemon process that operated periodically in the background on people's machines when they were running them, and it returned a bunch of results from various Google search products, aggregated those results on a central server along with their demographic details, so we could analyze and see the extent to which search results are personalized from, say, Google News, from YouTube, from Google Video, and from Google Search. And with these results, we could then start to paint a picture to which, the ways with this common starting point of these key terms, people's search was different across this. A key result that now James Meese is very much involved in interrogating this data as well, is in the news aspect of this, is what I would term, and hopefully I get this right for James's sake, a vanillaization of the news content. That we see that Google is, in its news product at least, has tended towards trying to find the safe middle ground, right? So it's largely ABC content. And I look, people jokingly refer to the ABC sometimes as the Angus Broadcasting Corporation, because I'm on it every other bloody second of the day, talking about, research or whatever. But, and so it's no slight on the ABC, but it's a safe bet, right? Like, it's a public broadcaster and this information is largely trusted and it's a safe bet. But you do see perhaps a bit of a homogenization of content when that's the only source of truth that you're accessing within your news results that you're returning. And so I think there's a concern that I would have around the kind of hollow ground that the center of the political realm presents, right? That, you know, centrist politics is not necessarily the answer here for many of society's most pressing concerns right now. Certainly look at climate change and how badly things are going there. We probably need a little bit more, if I'm going to say and declare my kind of socialist leanings, a bit more radical politics right now to address this most existential concern. And when all search products are basically trying to be not controversial, not political, and try and, you know, vanillarize their content and what comes out, I get a little bit concerned by that, right? That it's, yeah, that's not necessarily the answer here.
Louisa, so I know that in your research, you've looked very closely at Amazon and search on Amazon, and you have an insight into how people use Amazon as search and you know, the kinds of curation issues that Dan has spoken about in relation to Google. So how do you see this issue from the perspective of your research?
So I think one interesting thing that it was also discussed in the keynote is that search kind of engulfs so much more than web search, and that people use so many websites and applications as a form of search. So one of the things I did was look at the Amazon bookstore and the kind of books that get returned for what we might think of as socioculturally controversial or potentially polarizing areas. So for those who aren't very familiar, one of the terms was the 1619 Project in the US. This was a project turned book that was spearheaded in 2019 by the journalist Nicole Hannah-Jones with the New York Times, and its stated aim was to reframe US history in a way that really centered the role of slavery and the contributions of Black Americans. It was very polarizing in the US context. You had the right wing launched a campaign against it. There were even allegations by people like Joan Donovan that there was a keyword squatting campaign being used by the right wing, sort of purposely using the keyword 1619 Project with the direct aim of influencing search results on things like Google, YouTube, etc. So it was a very hot topic. And I think one of the things that it forced me to really grapple with was not only the way that terms become controversial, etc., which is obviously a very important thing, but it's also that what search engulfs is so varied. So the way as a society we think about books is very different to the way we think about news, or maybe a YouTube video, or a song on Spotify. We have, it's an important cultural object. We have like long-standing norms around books. We worry a lot about books being banned or being suppressed. So it's that there's a tendency, and Bernard Reeder writes that, you know, we use the term information to kind of draw everything into the realm of computers, but that actually there's a lot of benefit in unpacking that term, and that when we're thinking about the way that search penetrates these very different areas, we pay close attention to what we are searching for. Like books matter. If we're searching for people, it matters that they're people, not a document. So I think that's what I would say.
Ooh. Alistair, and how does this look to you from your perspective as a computer scientist? Grab the mic.
I don't think I've got any particular thing to add here, apart from to say again that we can do it if you want it done. You know, and we will do it if you don't tell us it shouldn't be done. That's probably the flip side of that. So someone will think about how to do it and will make it start happening unless they're told you shouldn't be doing it, because while we all conscious of research ethics requirements and so on, and we'll go through the application process to our institutional boards to get permission to do something that we think is involving an ethics decision, we often might not make that decision that it does involve an ethics decision until after we've tried to do it. Okay, so you know, computer scientists will just keep on trying to do it, just like geneticists will keep on trying to build new organisms out of cloning or whatever. They keep going because they can, and they're driven by the innate, very selfish curiosity of, can I make this happen before someone else does? Sorry.
See, I think that's really interesting because there's two things to unpack there. One is, you say, well, if you want it done, we can do it. And the question is, who's you there? Who's doing the wanting? Louisa mentioned the fact that we've left this to the market, right? We've kind of left the question of what good search looks like to a market, and not just any market, a two-sided market, one where in fact it's not being paid for by the people using the service in many cases, where it's being paid for by advertisers, for example. And that means that what we want isn't necessarily what's going to rule what comes out at the other end, because you are, a search engine that is powered by advertising is trying, or any service that's powered by advertising is trying to serve different kinds of markets. I mean, the same is true of Amazon. It's just differently operating. So I think that's really interesting, and it puts a real question over that quote. If it doesn't work for people, it doesn't work. I'm not convinced that's true anymore. If it doesn't work for the people paying for it, it doesn't work. And to an extent, that means we've got services that we really want, and like lots of things that are really good, and search that is incredibly efficient and enables a remarkable amount of information to come to our attention. Whether we could do it better, whether we could think about ways that could look better or more diverse, or there could be more options instead of, because the other thing I think about when I was thinking about that question of, like, how does this change our relationship with information? It's like, it's that one search box for everything. And then we listened to the history this morning, and as well, people are looking for websites, or they're looking for information about the population of a city in 300 years ago, or they're looking, and we're looking for so many different things. And, information science and knowledge management would tell us different things matter depending on what you're looking for. Is there a way we can do that better? And I think we're learning, but, it's raises some interesting questions.
And just on this topic, can we talk more specifically about the proper role of government in search? And this is a big topic, but or maybe we could start with competition and antitrust. So, Kim, what's your kind of your short take on that issue?
Because everyone here wants antitrust 101, right? Well, if you did want antitrust 101, you wouldn't come to me for it. I'm the intellectual property expert. Look, there are a couple of things. There are so many things going on here. You raise the question, what is the proper role of government here? One potential answer to that is down the antitrust type route. You say, actually, we don't want single big companies having all of the control and being able to buy up competitors, etc. And there's a very respectable train of thought that says that competition law has kind of failed over the last 20 years, and that's, or 20, 30 years, and that's been one of our big problems in this digital space. It's not the only problem in the digital space, so, network effects are real. Another problem with involvement of government in search is that as soon as you try to say, well, the government should be able to decide what kind of information we receive and how it should be ordered, or, what things are okay or not okay to include in a search index. Now, if you're American, you just completely freak out and go, "Oh, First Amendment!" That's the end of the debate, really. In other countries, we have a more nuanced view of what free speech requires, and that's why what's happening in Europe is so interesting, right? Because Europe has a very strong human rights framework, which includes a very strong interest in promoting freedom of speech, but it also has a broader human rights framework and considers other rights, including, rights not to be harmed by discrimination, by all sorts of important rights that can be a counter to that. So we've had this very, I think Louisa's right. We're at another inflection point, and the question is whether we can change the way that law relates to these systems and the way that governments relate to these systems and to search, and whether we can, whether government is in a position to start stating some values or rights that need to be built in to the way that information is presented. Now, that is not going to be a straightforward debate. That is not going to be a straightforward debate at all. It would be nice, just to circle back to your initial question, it would be nice to think about how we do diversity better in terms of search engines and search. And, that might mean, it might not mean breaking up Google, because frankly, how? But it might mean working on that question of how others build on the bigger sources of information, the bigger networks, so that there can be more diverse kinds of offerings built on the same models. I mean, it's one of the interesting things about the foundation model idea, right, is that you could have all of these different apps offering different kinds of search or different kinds of ways of engaging with information depending on like some underlying model. But yeah, not straightforward, really not.
And Louisa, do you want to add to that from a European perspective?
I think a lot remains to be seen with the European perspective, because it's just passed, right? And we're going to be seeing a lot of, I think, discussion about whether it's working well or not. I think it's quite ambitious, and I think, as everyone who works on the Search Experience project will tell you, getting transparency around these systems is a very hard challenge in itself, even before you start thinking about what good looks like. So I'm hopeful, because I feel like there's no other way. Like, we really need to be doing this. Whether it will be perfect, I'm sure it won't. But I think we wait and see we're not going to know until the next couple of years whether it's working well or not.
I just want to tack on one other thought on this issue of governance. I mean, aside from the history that Sue pointed out this morning, there's also the, I guess, parallel history of the internet itself and the kind of protocols and standards and all. Like, the internet 30 years ago was a very, very different landscape with very, very different protocols and discussions around those protocols and such. And so, you think before the emergence of these mega tech organizations, those panels, and I think like when I'm in Brisbane, we've got APNIC just down the road, and I love chatting and catching up with that crew, because it's always, I guess, for me, I feel hope when I go and speak to them, because they've still got, I think, one of the most functional kind of multi-stakeholder governance models on the planet today, where you've got them kind of negotiating between governments, corporate interests, academics, other third parties, to try and come up with a set of standards and rules that keep the whole thing together as one functioning internet and prevent the kind of splinter net from happening. And so, yeah, part of this, I think, in this moment is us, and it sounds boring, but kind of thinking again around what are the standards, what are the protocols that we need to think about, invest in, to keep things together a little bit, right? To avoid the splintering and and also thinking carefully around what are maybe some of the big end of town pushing for, right? Like, when we're thinking, and this is what got me thinking about it when Kim was talking about advertising largely being the drip feed that has powered much of the the money into the development of these technologies of web search. It's thinking about how those companies are now pushing back against some standards or trying to write them in ways that are favorable to them, in the ways that are going to protect them from maybe us as interested public, interest academics getting data that could actually show, hey, hang on, maybe that's not cool what you're doing over there, or other things like this. So I think that's another dimension to this, is paying continual close attention to the arguments and the way that standards processes are still playing out in the background around all the bright, shiny new things that generative AI is.
Alistair, would you like to respond? Or
No, I think I'll
Okay, well, I have another question for you, if you don't mind. But I mean, your work has been central to the development of search for many years, and I'm told your book, Managing Gigabytes, was used extensively by Larry Page and Sergey Brin when they were building Google in the 1990s. So, with the benefit of your experience, how do you see the next phase of search technology evolving, and what, especially in terms of how people are going to be using search?
Yeah, well, if I had a crystal ball and could sell my vision to the Australian Research Council, I'd be a laureate professor, right? And the future would be glowing and rosy and wonderful and bright. The problem is that I've spent a career dealing with itty bitty little things and picking holes in what other people have done and said, oh, I can do that better than you can, ha 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 ha, kind of thing. Or you're an idiot, you didn't see that you won't be able to do it that way, here's my way. And trying to look ahead. So right now the whole dense retrieval thing, where instead of it being an index and keywords and you're looking for the keywords, dense retrieval is trying to identify concepts out of the text and essentially apply numeric scores to concepts, but in a way that you can't actually pin down a column of a matrix and say, this is the concept that is cats or dogs. So when people ask me, how does dense retrieval work, or how does search in general work, I say, well, this document got ranked first ahead of that document because this document got represented by a vector of 768 floating point numbers, and the query got represented by a vector of 768 floating point numbers. And when you took the inner product, you got a bigger number than when you did any of the other inner products. And they say, what are the floating point numbers? And you have to say, I don't really know. They came from training data, from a learning algorithm that said, oh, well, let's put these things together and make this column of floating point numbers out of the 768. And no one can turn that inside out and say, what does that column represent though? So when we're talking about it, we say, oh, there might be a column that represents business, and there might be a column that represents sport, and there might be a column that represents four-legged animals, and there might be a column that represents a region of the world with different values of these floating point numbers. But we don't know. It's completely hostile to scrutiny. And so that's now the way of doing more effective retrieval. It's not more efficient. So, I spend some of my time, not this week because I've got first year classes going on, but in other weeks that are less hostile to research, trying to figure out how to do those operations more efficiently and make that faster. And it's a repeat of what I was doing 30 years ago when it was inverted indexes, and how to make the operations faster or need less space, or how to get the same answer without doing as much computation. So shedding some of the computational load and saying that part can be bypassed. And I'm still doing the same things. It's just on different types of data. And 30 years ago, I could explain why I was trying to generate that answer. Today, I can't. I just know that I've got to try and do it. I said I was a fraud. I really did.
Dan, one last question for you before we open it up for comments from the audience. But it's often said that search has changed our relationship to knowledge permanently by making information more plentiful, accessible, cheap, convenient to access, and so forth. But from the perspective of your research, so you have a very good understanding of how people search, but you also study things like misinformation, disinformation, fake news, so forth. How do you respond to some of those claims that search has made us smarter?
Yeah, I like to think of it, and I draw from my computer science background and thinking about this and visualizing in my head of like a giant curve. And if you think about everyone under a curve, and you can't push that curve up and maybe push it more towards, say, a socially positive direction without perhaps expecting also by pushing it up and more people entering the area underneath that it also maybe grows a little bit at the other socially bad end, right? And so, yes, absolutely, when you connect more of the world to the world's information, you get greater diversity of the kind of information that's shared. And yeah, we have to accept that some of that is not going to be necessarily from that, what most of us from our particular positionalities would think of as, socially good or, good quality information and such. And yeah, it's been very interesting to watch. I mean, again, another parallel history in line with web search is obviously social media and the whole kind of participatory aspect of the web, as we've seen in the last 15 years, 20 years, the emergence of us as people become more and more online. And yeah, this is a space where I guess the danger here is obviously the common things around free speech and around how we allow participation, who gets to participate, how we rank that information in an authoritative way. As I alluded to already in one of my previous answers, I'm a little bit concerned around like vanillaization of that content necessarily being the answer here in all cases, that, oh, well, to avoid controversy, we just go for the middle of the road kind of answer in all cases. I think there are better ways to go about trying to make sure that our information environments are full of quality information. And yeah, I don't want to stand here and give it it's complex, right? And we don't know. We do know there are some ways in which you can improve this. And one is through, much of the research in the center around looking at digital literacy and ways of connecting people in to have ways to authentically connect and do so. Some of it is just time as well, that many of the people that are coming online they need time to actually express themselves, to develop their own literacies in ways and develop their own community norms and standards in a way that then they will become and start to hopefully become more productive rather than destructive in terms of some of the things that they're doing. But yeah, at this stage, I don't know. We've still got billionaires buying up social media platforms and themselves being active proponents of disinformation. So perhaps some of it is also maybe we look at taxing some people and taking some of that tax dollars and putting in the hands of positive social initiatives rather than just giving them continual tax breaks and, letting them blow spaceships up on landing pads, over in the States somewhere.
Well, I think on that it's a great time now to turn to the audience, see what you make of all this, of some of these big questions that are on the table. We don't have answers for you necessarily, but they're I think we've definitely had a lot of great perspectives on these. So let's hand over to you. We have one question here. I believe there's a roving mic going around.
The system was very fast, so they got their answers quickly, and they weren't bombarded with irrelevant advertising. And at the same time, search engines that promoted results based on the commercial interests of their advertisers just went down the tubes. So the modern search engines are a very fine balance between the advertising interests that fund the thing, but you can't go entirely by the commercial interests if it doesn't serve the users.
And in response to that, I'll say perfectly correct. So one of the most wonderful things about Google when it launched was the white page that didn't fill up rapidly or slowly with information about upcoming TV programs, little screenshots of this, advertising logos before it painted the results.
Flashing ads.
Yeah, flashing ads, the old flashing, the blink tag in HTML. But they also had a mindset that they weren't going to try and make money while they were building it. They had the mindset that their most important asset wasn't cash in the bank, it was eyeballs on the screen, and that Sue said earlier they had no business model. They didn't have an explicit one, but I'm confident in the back of their minds they had one which was to capture the hearts and the souls and the brains of a generation of people and have them going to Google as the go-to place, so that when they did figure out how to start making money out of it via the sponsored links section or the AdWords, rather than hiding them amongst the organic results, they would be able to monetize it. So in a complex balance sheet kind of way, they were building their assets because their assets were those people who migrated to it because they weren't seeing ads. So it's a complicated, multi-dimensional balance sheet, not just a monetary balance sheet.
And I also wonder whether that position has changed over time, right? Having, you know, it may well be true, and I don't doubt it being one of those people who move very rapidly from other search engines to Google with the white page. I don't doubt that there was a massive movement, and I don't doubt that that was because the service was better and it was offering what people wanted. Whether it is still true that it is offering the best possible service for all of the people who use it, or whether that balance between consumers and advertisers may have shifted somewhat over time, I think is a more open question.
Yeah, I would agree with Kim here that the way that people are searching, particularly youth of today are searching, is they're not going to Google Maps to find, you know, recommendations for meals or such. They're going to social platforms to find those. And, you know, I remember reading an article by a frustrated Google engineer on this of like, my God, but we built the perfect solution, right? It's Maps and it's there. And it's like, why are they using this? It's like, well, no, like they don't, it's actually no longer for them, for that particular demographic, the perfect solution, right? So it's this thing that it's a dynamic entity as well, right? And in that history, I also remember search engine optimization, right? And like when Google itself became polluted by these pages that had started to figure out the secret source of, you know, PageRank and all the other various algorithms in how to get their page upranked in there. And on certain terms, it was pretty crap, right, in some ways. But again, then they figured that out. And so it's constant dance between how to ensure the quality of the search return. And I'll just offer one last observation on this. In the search experience project that we ran, a stark observation we made was the level of curation of, and I know I'm talking a lot about Google, but this could be generalized a bit, the stark kind of like curation of the homepage. You go to Google now and you type in on that little search bar, you don't get a list of search rankings. What you get is you get a little breakout box with a bit of like text maybe pulled from Wikipedia. You get maybe a graph with statistics showing if it's, say, you're looking for COVID statistics or something. You get a bunch of like other, you know, ad stuff on one side. You get a bunch of other breakout. Basically, you have to scroll 2 pages before you even encounter a search result sometimes on that home page. And so that product that Google released has radically changed to today compared to what it was. And it's largely because of consumer demand, you're right, of what people may want. But yeah, it's a highly dynamic entity that we're talking about. And so, yeah, I think we need to be clear about at what time we are also talking about this, yeah.
Yes, but my point was not that Google was good or there's anything wonderful about Google, but that people chose, people made the choice. And you're saying that the user experience in social media is better when finding restaurants and so on, so people moved.
Yeah, absolutely.
Question down the front here.
Oh, hi, thank you. So as search gets better, how do we go back to finding surprising, delightful, new, unexpected things?
TikTok.
How do it? Well, I mean, that has search too. That has a discovery page. That's also going recommendations based on what we have already said we wanted. What I'm asking is, how do we find surprising, delightful, new, unexpected things? Let me finish, please. That lets us get new connections that we are not expecting, and that allows us to go into that creative, innovative space where we are surprised and then generate something new.
Yeah, sorry, my TikTok interjection was humorous, not an answer. I think the answer comes from other forms of information seeking. We search when we think we know what we're looking for, and we browse when we're wanting to be surprised. So we go into the Readings bookstore up on Lygon Street and we browse. We allow things to come in front of us, and we hope that we're in a region of the store where there's a higher density of interestingness. So, you know, I might go to the books about computer science, or I might go to the CD collection, and I'll just flick through them. It's an increasingly depressing activity. You know, I said earlier that I get the newspaper delivered. I still buy CDs. I like the tangible object, even though I can't see the grooves. I can hold them up to the light and see the shiny reflection. So I browse. And what we are slowly killing off with the search box, even if it gets wider and wider and wider. So I've seen screenshots of a very early Microsoft Live search box that was 8 characters wide with another 4 characters available because file names were 8 characters with a dot and then 3 more characters. And of course you were searching for a file name. So you know, the box is now wider, the font is bigger, you can read what you typed into the box, assuming you go to the home page for the search. Most people just search through the search bar now, through the URL bar. But that assumes we know what we're looking for. Browsing is something that we need to be able to do. I was on a committee many years ago where we were talking about how to allow students to search for subjects to fit into their degrees up at the university. And I wanted to put a button there called "I'm feeling lucky" or "Try me out," that would just spin the wheels and throw up 3 subjects that were legal in the student's degree, fitted the timetable that they'd already established from the core subjects that they'd selected, and might be interesting to that student. And I didn't get my way, I'm sorry to say. But browsing is the answer, and throwing things up that you hope. So Netflix gives you recommendations, but it narrows you down pretty quickly. You get categorized as being a Korean romance drama person, and it's very hard to break out of that mold, I found. I'm sorry.
And Louisa, how do you see this issue of serendipity?
Yeah, so although it's not my field, the computer science field, as you know, discusses, you know, diversity and serendipity as something they want to build for as well, because otherwise people don't find these systems very useful if they're always showing them what they were already expecting or looking for. But what I wanted to sort of add to the discussion is there's a very interesting kind of ethical or political discussion that goes on around diversity and surprise as well. And just to give a few examples, so in the news space, there's a lot of discussion of should we show people diverse content in terms of, say, diverse perspectives? Should we make sure they're seeing news stories where you get minority voices so that it's not just the sort of mainstream or the usual suspects that are telling stories? You have in the dating space discussions about to what extent on dating apps should people be able to filter on ethnic categories. Do we want them to do that? What are the problems of them doing that? Should we actually try to expose people to a broader range? Or discussions about, so a lot of these systems draw on our behavior, but perhaps our expressed preferences would expose us to more diverse content, because when we behave, sometimes we get locked in cycles of clicking on things, even if it's not the thing that is actually going to kind of satisfy us. So I think, I really like your question, I guess is what I'm saying. And I think it has like lots of broad implications, even as our discussion is about society, that go beyond sort of immediate user satisfaction of being delighted, but also more broadly, who do we open ourselves up to, which voices get heard. I think it just has a lot there.
And we have one more question from Sue. Oh, I'm sorry, there's a couple in queue, but perhaps we could take 2 quickly.
I'll try and be quick, but it's a definite detour from the previous questions. So the Enlightenment brought us 2 great social projects. One was the creation of the Encyclopedia of Curated Knowledge. That was a very new concept in the 1750s. And a little bit later than that, the concept of the expert, the word expert, appeared around that time. And we built on these things for 220 years until about 1995. And then we suddenly started moving in a very different direction. So I'm just reading your title behind you, The Impact of Search on Society. And one impact has been the end of the Enlightenment project as it was conceived by the architects of the Enlightenment. And I'm just wondering if anyone on the panel wants to reflect on the fact that we no longer rely on curated knowledge, and it's incredibly hard, if you use search, to find out who is the expert in a field and what their voice is.
Great, and Louisa will respond. I think I'd just love to invite Sue to comment as well too, or ask a question before we wrap up. Go ahead.
You want to answer, Louisa?
Oh, no, sorry, if you, your question.
Oh, okay. So I wanted to ask Kim a question about, you talked about governance. How do you conceptualize that when you're dealing with such a wide range of organizations and countries that have different perspectives on, we'll say, freedom of speech versus more nuanced things? So at that end, it's about huge, a real high level of aggregation. The other end I haven't heard a lot about is how things like search and web search change individuals. So I think there's a really interesting book by called The Shallows, that talks about the role of technology in shaping human thought, communication patterns, going back to to things like the development of maps and timekeeping, and so it's two very different extremes of what impact is at a huge societal level and then at an individual level.
Thank you. So Louisa and Kim for some short responses. Thank you.
My first bit was on the expertise question. Yeah, I think it's a really interesting question. And I would say two things, perhaps. I recently noticed, so I'm sure most people here know that Google has these search quality evaluation guidelines, and they're publicly available. They're over 170 pages long, and they claim that this is how they get humans to evaluate the quality of search. And what that shows, whether it's in practice is implementable or not, is that there are a lot of quality markers that they take into account in deciding how to curate, especially around certain topics, right? And then expertise, however that's defined, matters more for certain topics over others. So say for humorous content, popularity might be more important to them, or like how many people sort of visited and hyperlink to it. And then for something like health, they would take different indicators into account. That doesn't mean it's perfect, but I think there is more and more. Actually, I saw again today, YouTube just said that they're making even more developments on their health information policies to involve experts even more. So I think we might be seeing actually amongst some of the platforms a move towards more reliance on expertise to counter some of the concerns that have been raised around quality of information. But something I will say that I think also ties into what you said is that these search quality guidelines, Google uses this acronym EAT. E is expertise, A is authoritativeness, and T is trustworthiness. And it says this is what it uses to guide. And it recently expanded that to EEAT. And the new E stands for experience. And so now they're taking experience into account as well as expertise, which I think is just very interesting to think about in terms of, like you said, how our ideas of expertise are changing and what information we value and from whom. So I think.
And just to amplify that, I don't know that we've lost the Enlightenment. I think we've democratized it somewhat. I think there are experts emerging from all corners of the population rather than the respected academics or whichever type of expert you want to talk about. And the example of that is the Wikipedia. I would suggest that the Wikipedia is at least as authoritative as any encyclopedia 30 years was. It's more dynamic. We don't have to pay for a yearly update book. And it's accessible to everyone. And I, for one, and perhaps there's others in the audience, if I get the pop-up box that says Wikipedia is a volunteer organization, please donate $10 to help us out, I click the link and pay them $20. I think we do have enlightenment still. It's just not coming from the people who call themselves experts. It's coming from the people who are genuinely experts.
That is a beautiful way to end, but we're going to hear from Kim before we finish up. Would you like to respond to
I can't match that.
To Sue's question?
Okay, so I'm not going to touch the expert question, although I have so many thoughts, because that was good. But you asked about this question of what governance is. And look, you rightly point out that there's different countries with extremely different perspectives on how these things should be regulated. So, Europe with its developing model around the platforms, the US has its own views about the freedom of platforms and the importance of Section 230 and freedom of speech. China has a different model, again, much more interventionist in the kinds of content. If you want to look for a model where, a government view of what quality information constitutes, that's kind of your model, which is interesting actually, and it is worth thinking about and exploring deeply as we move into this new era. And from a legal perspective, there isn't an easy answer to that because law is jurisdictional. We can control what services are offered in Australia, and we can enter into a kind of negotiation with a large platform at the stage where we want to change the terms of that deal. And, sometimes that is marginally successful. The search engines now do pay some media organisations for use of their content in Australia. There was a bit of a negotiation over that as they withdrew service and then decided they didn't want to withdraw service. And so a smaller country like Australia engages in a kind of two-way sort of deal-making process with platforms, to achieve governance goals. Europe, is seeking to promulgate its own values in this space. Preferably with global effect. They are designedly trying to, create a kind of global model. And, if you look at this from a legal perspective, we are in a competition of models scenario right now. And I don't know which way that plays out. But, unless you want to actually have a world government, that's the world we live in. It's not so bad, but it will be interesting to see how that competition plays out.
Well, please give a big round of applause for our four speakers. Thank you so much.